Hello, this is Hwansan Sunim. Please assume correct meditation posture. So together, inhale, hold, then exhale. Once again, inhale, hold, and then together, exhale. As our minds and our bodies relax, our breathing cycle will naturally get longer. Now let's enter into abdominal breathing together. Why don't we try it together? So inhale, hold, and then exhale. Once more, inhale, hold, and then exhale. And now we will raise our hwadu, 이 뭐고, the question this, what is this? This is the question that we will ask ourselves as we maintain this posture and conduct this abdominal breathing. So, together inhale, hold, and then together, 이 뭐고. Once again, inhale, hold, and then out loud, 이 뭐고. From this point forward until the end of the program, please continue to hold your meditative posture, continue to conduct your abdominal breathing, and continue to meditate internally, silently, on the question, this, what is this? What is this thing that I call I? The topic of today's contemplation and meditation is perfectionism. Recently, our viewers have been sending in questions regarding perfectionism, and it seems that people don't quite know how to feel about it. Some people say, I'm a perfectionist with pride, as if that's a noble standard to aspire to. Other people confessed, I'm a perfectionist, as if they're embarrassed, as if it's a neurotic approach to living and working and doing the things that we do. Some people have said that when they try to do meditation, they get obsessed with the details and begin to do it like other forms of work or study, becoming competitive and worried about whether they're doing it well or whether they're doing it right. So I think that this is a topic that deserves some consideration and discussion. Research psychologists who study perfectionism define perfectionism as a personality trait where people are striving for flawlessness. And this personality trait is usually followed by a number of other types of characteristics and tendencies. The first, perhaps most important one, is that perfectionists usually have very high performance standards. They strive to achieve very high ideals of performance. The second is that they tend to judge themselves in terms of their productivity and their accomplishments. They feel a stronger need for control in certain kinds of, in most types of performance situations. They also have a tendency to be obsessive. And finally, they have high willpower. Beyond that, they also have a tendency to be overly critical of themselves when they evaluate themselves. They also tend to be very highly concerned with the opinions and evaluations of others. Finally, when perfectionists are unable to achieve their goals, there's a tendency among them to fall into depression. Now, psychologists are divided on their view as to whether perfectionism is a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing. In one school of thought, psychologists say that there are two versions of perfectionism, which they label in two different ways, in a number of different ways. a negative version and a positive version. So they talk of adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism. They also call it normal perfectionism and neurotic perfectionism. In this viewpoint, where you think of perfectionism as occurring in two different types, healthy perfectionists, meaning normal adaptive ones, are considered to be motivated by their perfectionism to achieve very difficult goals. So this pushes them to go beyond what other normal people would do. And these kinds of so-called healthy perfectionists usually take pleasure from their high level of effort. And their perfectionism is associated with a high level of self-esteem. In other words, they tend to be proud of the fact that they're perfectionists. On the other hand, those who are called maladaptive or neurotic perfectionists tend to suffer from their form of perfectionism. They tend to set unrealistic goals. And the effort in trying to achieve some level of flawlessness is usually followed with great levels of anxiety and stress and depression because of a fear of failure. And their form of perfectionism is usually associated with low self-esteem. They're trying to be perfect in a sense to compensate for a low estimation of themselves as people. Now, in the second school of thought, perfectionism, all forms of perfectionism are considered unhealthy. They claim that perfectionism is actually the expression of a fear of imperfection. And from this point of view, many, if not all perfectionists, feel that in order to receive love, respect, and affection from others, they must be perfect. So therefore, this form of perfectionism is considered a burden that perfectionists feel to be very oppressive. And their fear of failure, their fear of appearing or being imperfect in the eyes of others or within their own viewpoint causes them to feel extremely high levels of anxiety, stress, depression, and so forth that they would just rather do without. So in this school of thought, perfectionism is considered, unhealthy and something that needs to be remedied. Now, I would like to add to this then, instead of making some judgment as to whether perfectionism is good or bad, maybe we could look at this personality trait through a Buddhist lens. Now, when you talk of a person striving for flawlessness, from a Buddhist point of view, that means that a person is trying to create a certain image of themselves. Because the truth is, human beings are simply not flawless. The truth is that physically and mentally, we are not perfect. Physically, we are prone to disease. We can get exhausted. We need to shower, eat, and take care of ourselves and medically treat ourselves. Mentally, we don't know everything there is to know. So it's clear that we're not perfect, individually or as a species. So when we strive for flawlessness, that means we are trying to sort of rearrange our appearance, trying to change ourselves into something else. And from the Buddhist perspective, that means that we are creating an image of ourselves. Now, the Buddhist critique of normal human consciousness, of a so-called unenlightened being, is that the definition of being unenlightened means that we cannot directly perceive or experience the truth and reality of our own existence. We cannot see directly, either physically, mentally, or otherwise, what or who we truly are, or the basic nature and reality of this world that we live in. It is because of this that we have to keep creating ideas and theories and hypotheses, both about ourselves and the world that we live in, and even about the species, the human race to which we belong. So our self-images, our image of ourself, the identities that we create for ourselves, are both a symptom and a proof that we cannot truly see who and what we are. And from this point of view, within this context, the Buddhist project, the Buddhist goal, is to put down the need for all self-images and all self-conceptions, and through meditation arrive at the state of enlightenment whereby we can truly perceive the reality of our own existence and the world around us. So from this point of view, any self-image is considered a hindrance, or at best, an undeveloped level of consciousness. So if we look at it in this way, perfectionism is in the sense the creation of a kind of self-image that we are aspiring to. And I believe it's a very specific kind of self-image. It is the image of our ideal self. It is the best version of ourselves that we can imagine. And most likely, if we are not enlightened, probably every single person has some image within themselves of their ideal self. And we have very specific emotional reactions to our own ideal self-image. We want to be that way. We desire it. We also feel a sense of responsibility or obligation to be that way. So we have a very powerful attraction to this ideal self-image of ours, and the tendency is that if we feel that the way that we are, the way that we behave, and the course of our life events resemble what our ideal self-image portrays, then we tend to feel more safe, more confident, and more joyful. If, on the other hand, the way that we are, the way that we behave, and the flow of our life events seem to be moving away from this ideal self-image that we have in our minds, then we tend to feel anxious, insecure, and we tend to feel negative emotions. We feel bad about ourselves. So this is the tendency, and I think there are schools of thought within modern psychology that also describe similar phenomenon. Now, from the Buddhist point of view, to have any sort of false self-image or any contrived image of ourselves is a sign of unenlightenment, and ultimately needs to be treated, needs to be resolved through spiritual practice. But if we can look at it in conventional terms, because realistically speaking, most of the people in this world are not enlightened, we might be able to say that relatively healthy people know that the ideal self-image can never truly be attained. We can never truly become this perfect version of ourselves that we have drawn within our own minds. So we tend not to be as obsessed with it. The second thing that we also know is that this ideal self-image changes over time. The best version of ourselves, our ideal self that we imagine at the age of 20, is something quite different than when we imagine ourselves at the age of 40. Now, the problem, I believe, that arises in something like perfectionism is that when we become obsessed with the ideal self-image, when we make it the center of our inner world, the center of our minds and our hearts, and to borrow some religious terminology or to borrow a religious metaphor, it's as if we create an altar in our mind and we set our ideal self-image on that altar as an idol, as an icon to be worshipped. This, I want to argue, is perhaps the most destructive and the most pure form of what they call idolatry, the worship of idols. Real idolatry, truly destructive idolatry occurs, I believe, when we create an image in our own minds and we begin to worship that image, meaning we put upon ourselves the very onerous obligation of having to become exactly like that image. And we expand that image. We create an image of ourselves that has every possible positive characteristic that we can wish for ourselves. So this ideal self within our minds, the best version of myself, for example, must be successful, must be powerful, must be well respected, must be wealthy, must be popular, must be attractive. It's an endless list of positive attributes that we keep adding to this self-image of ours. And we use this self-image to judge ourselves absolutely. And of course, it's not going to make us feel good. We also use it to judge nearly everything around us, so that anything that resembles this image, or seems to, is taken as good, and anything that doesn't is taken as bad. And therefore, it creates within us a spirit and attitude of intolerance. Ultimately, this leads to a form of self-enslavement. We can no longer think at all outside of the oppressive standards created by this self-image. Everything that we think, do, say, and undertake, we judge according to these impossible standards of this ideal self-image. And so we become completely imprisoned in that altar, in front of that altar underneath this idol. So this is what I believe occurs when we take it upon ourselves to be perfect in some way. If we think to ourselves, I should be this, given my background and so forth, I should be this, then most likely we have hidden somewhere within our minds an oppressive, ideal self-image that we are imprisoned by, and that we are constantly judging ourselves by, and that causes us pain every time we think that we are not the same as that ideal self-image. This is extremely dangerous, and it's also creates enormous amounts of suffering, because ultimately this ideal self-image is a delusional fantasy. It's also a fantasy because it's impossible. No human being, no one human being can have so many, can have all possible positive human attributes. So we are enslaved fundamentally by a lie that we have somehow implanted within ourselves. So if that's the case, then what is the solution? And I would like to propose on this program as antidote the famous decree of the Oracle of Delphi, the Delphic Oracle, which goes, know thyself, know yourself. If we want to escape the clutches of the ideal self, the only way we can is by getting to know who and what we really are, both on the ultimate level of, from the Buddhist perspective of enlightenment, but also on the conventional level of who am I really, what am I capable of, what am I not good at, to be able to face ourselves objectively. Now, this is actually a very, very difficult thing to do. I believe actually it's one of the most, maybe it's the most difficult thing that a person can do. Maybe it's the most courageous thing that a person can undertake. Because when we look at ourselves directly in the mirror, almost inevitably we will see things that disappoint us, that frighten us, and also that we may feel repulsed by. So it's not an easy thing to look in the mirror. And what I would like to propose on this program is that we use meditation to deal with these difficult emotional responses. Because meditation teaches us the art and skill of emotional self-regulation. If we just try to look at ourselves point blank, most likely it will be difficult. Most likely also we'll be confused as we have all these different kinds of conflicting emotional reactions to what we see. Now, as we do this, as we use meditation and undertake the task of coming to know ourselves, and as we come to know ourselves, to accept ourselves, and to go through the painful process of coming to terms with the way that we really are, with all of our own all-too-human limitations and all of our own weaknesses and so forth. As we learn to do that, I believe, and I would like to recommend that we learn to make 4 very important distinctions that I believe can help us transform what might be a burdensome or dysfunctional perfectionism into a more positive way of striving and motivating ourselves. So the first distinction that I would like to recommend for perfectionists who are trying to come to terms with their perfectionism is that we need to learn how to distinguish between perfectionism, striving for excellence, and doing your best. Now, once again, I would like to say that perfectionism, striving for perfection, is, although it seems admirable and maybe even heroic, we have to be honest and say that nothing in this world is truly ever perfect. And what I mean by that is anything and everything can always be improved. We can always go further. We can always do better. And it's better to think in terms that we have no limits to our striving, rather to think that there's some peak that once we arrive at, everything's done. So that's the first thing, that there really is, that we can always do better. But the more important thing is that in any field of endeavor, the rules and standards are always changing. New paradigms, new models of doing that thing arrive and completely change our understanding of that field of endeavor. And I'll give you just a simple example. In the recent history of Western painting, once upon a time, everyone thought that a good painting is a painting that looks really realistic, something that looks like a perfect copy of reality. And then the camera was invented. And suddenly ordinary people who can afford photographic equipment or can afford to hire a photographer could now create highly realistic images without going through all the problem of painting. And so this changed the game of painting. And painters had to think, well then, what do we do now? How do we define painting? We will always be beaten by the machines. And so they thought about it, and they began to think of painting in terms of self-expression. That our painting is not portraying the world out there, it's portraying the world inside, the invisible world of thoughts and feelings, the invisible world of the mind. And so painting now becomes a form of self-expression, not a way of mimicking physical reality. Now what's happened here is that the rules, the standards, and the goals have completely changed. So if you bring to this new kind of painter who's only asking for self-expression, and you show them a photorealistic painting, let's say that's a bad painting. That's old-fashioned. We've gone beyond that. Likewise, if you took the newest kind of painting, these abstract, types of paintings, and you took a time machine and went back before the invention of the camera, and you showed it to the photorealistic painters, they would say, this isn't even a painting. The entire standard and concept and model of perfection has changed entirely. Standards of perfection are fluid. They will always change in time because we ourselves are always changing in time. So perfectionism, maybe the idea of it can motivate us, but we must understand that it is fundamentally an illusion and that it will always change. So maybe we can set aside perfectionism and consider striving for excellence, these other two ideas, and doing your best. Now this is kind of a thing that causes, I think, especially young people, some confusion. And I want to give an example. Let's say that I'm a student and I want to perform really well on my next test. So I really, really try hard. I study really, really hard. I follow all the rules. I do my best. I take the test and I get a D. Now, how am I supposed to judge myself? Shall I be proud of myself for doing my best? Or shall I be ashamed because I failed to achieve excellence? We are told both by society, usually by our families, that you have to do your best. If you do your best, that's enough. You should be proud. Winning and losing are not everything. On the one hand, we hear that. On the other hand, you should strive for excellence. You should strive for greatness. So, how do we judge that situation? And I would like to suggest here that once again the answer is know thyself. Know what your strengths and weaknesses are. If you know your strengths and weakness, you know what to expect excellence of, and you know when to be satisfied by just giving a really good, sincere effort. And align your life so that when you undertake excellence, you're using your strengths. And if you're forced into a position where you must perform or execute something that you are naturally not so good at, then be satisfied with doing your best. The balance that we can achieve between recognizing our own sincerity and doing our best and demanding excellence of ourselves, that balance can only occur when we know ourselves. The second distinction that I would like to suggest that we learn how to make is to know the difference between being obsessive, being meticulous, and being what I call accurate. Obsessive, I'm going to say, is being overly concerned and focused with details that don't fundamentally matter. And I'll give you an example of this from my own life experience. In our temple, when I first started out as a monastic, we used to have to make dumplings. And when we made the dumplings, we made as much as we possibly could, so everybody could eat as much as they like. And one of the members of our monastic community, whenever he made the dumplings, he had to make everyone exactly the same size and put them in rows, perfect rows, like a checkerboard pattern. Now, this way of doing things, first of all, was slow. It doesn't help the process, and it doesn't make the process more enjoyable, and it doesn't create a better end result, because in the end, we put all of the dumplings into a pot and we boil it. So the process is not improved, and the result is not improved. So this can be cited as an example of being obsessive, being too focused on details that don't change anything and just slow you down. Now, I don't mean to make fun of this kind of personality. Obsessive, what we call obsessive personality types have their place in the world and have their contribution to make, I believe. And I think this kind of personality or this approach to doing things is very helpful, for example, in the realm of executing religious ceremonies, where it's extremely important that you follow a certain protocol and obey a certain form and do things in the right order and do everything just so. So I'm not trying to make a value judgment here that obsessive is bad and the other things are good. I'm just saying that each thing has its own virtues and limitations. And in the modern world, often, if not usually, the obsessive approach can be kind of, it can hinder us. So know when you're being obsessive and know when it's okay to be obsessive. Now, the next thing is meticulous, and I'm going to say that meticulous is a habit of being very precise. And once again, to draw on personal experience, in my own monastic community, we were always encouraged to be extremely meticulous, to be extremely precise. And my own teacher, Sun Master Songdam, was kind of legendary in his meticulous. He was said to be extremely precise in everything that we do. So we were all trained to be that way. And, this is a good way of doing things. But later, after I became the attendant of Sun Master Songdam and sort of got to spend more time with him, I began to realize that there is another level of approach to our work habits that I believe is more refined than simple meticulousness. What happened is, shortly after I became his attendant, I began to see his living space for the first time. And now, because there was this legend in our monastic community that he's, totally precise and totally meticulous, I thought that when I saw, for example, the room that he lives in, it would be like the room of an elite military officer. Everything perfect. The shoes are shining like mirrors. The socks are folded exactly the same. Everything's in its place. No dust. If you drop a coin on his bed, it'll bounce. That's what I thought I would see. And actually, it was far from it. Parts of the room were very clean and neat. Parts of them were not. And I was very surprised by this. And it took me a long time before I began to understand that he was not being he was not being meticulous. He was being what I will call accurate, meaning he was generating the level of meticulousness that the situation demands. That he is not imposing his order of meticulousness on the world. He is following the flow of the world and giving it what it needs. Sometimes the world needs high clinical precision. Other times the world needs casualness. So, to give another example, if we're preparing for a formal dinner party, then yes, we should be very, very precise and put every utensil in its place and use the right plates and the right bowls and, serve the right food. That's when meticulous is good. But if we're just having a casual party, then that might create tension. So it might be better just to make a buffet and just be very relaxed. Again, let the situation determine our level of meticulousness. And if we want to have the wisdom to be accurate in our assessment of what the situation demands, then once again, we need to know. We need to be able to perceive, know ourselves, know the situation that we're in. So I won't say that meticulous is bad, but what I will say that I learned from my teacher, Sun Master Songdam, that there is a higher level of meticulousness that is more creative, more flexible, and more abundant. So that's another level of distinction. Now, the third distinction that I would like to make is the ability to distinguish between a personal defect, a mistake, and what I will call an unexpected result. Personal defect is is a trap that perfectionists often fall into, and that is this idea that if I make a mistake, it is proof of a personal flaw in me. My mistakes are the reflections of my flaws. And this is considered by psychologists to be a very unhealthy and stressful way of looking at the world, because nobody never makes mistakes. So if you're thinking in that way, recognize it and take steps through meditation and whatever other resources that you may have to avoid that. Now we come to the idea of mistakes. And researchers say that healthy perfectionists or strivers for excellence usually have a very resilient response to mistakes. When they make a mistake, it usually inspires them to try harder. It's like a kind of boxer who fights harder the more they get hit. Every mistake makes them try harder. And I think our society and our culture look up to this kind of idea. We find it admirable, and it is admirable in a certain sense. It takes courage and tenacity and persistence to be able to face and overcome our own slip-ups and our own mistakes like that. But once again, I would like to offer a third alternative, that maybe in this world there are no mistakes. And if we can use meditation to regulate our emotions, then what we begin to see is that there's fundamentally no difference really between success and failure. There is a predicted turn of events and an unpredicted turn of events. And each form of consequence offers its own set of limitations and opportunities. Maybe realistically, it's simply not as desirable as what we wanted before. Maybe we really wanted to go to a certain school, but we couldn't go, and we're going to this other school, and honestly, I would rather have gone to the other school. Honestly, I would rather have worked at that other company. Honestly, I would rather be living in this other place. But if we spend our time in regret and sorrow and missing what we can't have, we lose the present moment. So, more than anything else, when we face our mistakes, our failures, our perceived defeats, it's very important that we have a technique to become emotionally objective again, to see it as simply the unexpected result and to move forward into it. Now finally, for the last distinction I would like to suggest is that we learn how to distinguish between unrealistic dreaming and what I will call reasonable optimism. Unrealistic dreaming, I'm going to say, is the belief that every single human being has unlimited ability, and if we just make our minds up, we can do anything that we set our minds to. I personally believe that it is true, that both our minds and our bodies contain untapped potential, potentially infinite potential, both on the mental and physical level. Nonetheless, we may believe that we have unlimited potential, unlimited ability, but what we know is we have limited time. We simply don't have the time in one lifetime, even if we were unlimited, to develop every single possible talent and potential and skill that I might have. We simply have to make choices about what we choose to pursue and what we choose to develop within ourselves. And the only way to know how to choose, which way to go, what part of myself to work on, is again to know myself, to use meditation and to come to terms with myself. It's not an easy thing to admit it, that you have certain weaknesses, limitations, certain things that hold you back. But we need to come to a realistic self-assessment. We need to go through the process of becoming disappointed with certain aspects of ourselves that we don't want to admit, becoming saddened, realizing that we have to give up certain dreams because we simply may not have the opportunity, the ability, or the resources to pursue it. But it is only through this painful process of self-discovery, this cultivation of self-honesty, that we ultimately arrive at the ability to accept and respect ourselves for who we are. Finally, not to judge ourselves by some impossible self-ideal. The early 20th century thinker Krishnamurti said, "To observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence." Observing without evaluating, I believe, means that you look at yourself, but you don't make value judgments. Good, bad, admirable, shameful, winner, loser, success, failure. You simply see things for what they are. You make an honest, very clear evaluation of yourself and be as honest as you possibly can. Self-acceptance must be based on self-honesty. So when you say observe without evaluating, that doesn't mean you just look at yourself and just say, oh, I'm okay. It's really not. It's a very penetrating, very, very almost clinically honest way of looking at yourself. And when you can do that, you can accept yourself. And this is the paradox, what Carl Rogers, the father of the so-called humanistic approach to psychology, called the curious paradox. Carl Rogers said, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I change. How do we change? We change because we become free. We become free of endlessly trying to live up to an impossible self-ideal. We become free of endlessly trying to pursue standards that do not exist in the world. When we become free, new life possibilities open up in front of us. We can imagine ourselves now living in different ways that we couldn't imagine before. We can imagine ourselves letting go of this impossible self-image, trying out different ways of living, different ways of behaving, different ways of relating to other people. Maybe we'll accept a job that before we found unacceptable. Maybe we'll become friends with people that before we couldn't accept. Maybe we'll dress and behave and eat and talk in ways that before we thought was not appropriate for ourselves. This is the freedom we gain through self-acceptance. This is the freedom that we gain when we put down that impossible self-ideal. So this is something that I would very much like to suggest to those of us who struggle with perfectionism. Why don't we take a break here, and when we get back, we will enter the inner voice. Hello again, and welcome to the Inner Voice. This week we have an email from one of our viewers in Hong Kong who has asked for anonymity. So I will call this person JB. Dear Hwansan Sunim, I'm writing to ask about the 108 bows in Korean Son Buddhist practice. What is it, and how do I practice it at home? Please refrain from using my full name and photo in public. I don't like public attention too much and prefer to stay quieter in my daily life. Thanks. All the best, JB. Thank you, too, for sending us your question and for your interest in our program. And I hope that this way of referring to you doesn't bring you too much public attention. Now, you've asked about the 108 bows in Korean Son Buddhist practice, which is a very common form of religious and spiritual practice in Korean Buddhism. Basically speaking, the 108 bows is a practice aimed at purifying our consciousness, specifically at eliminating what are called the karmic seeds of our negative, sinful behavior. Now, in order to understand what a karmic seed is, we need to understand that in the Mahayana Buddhist view of things, every moment of our experience, both in this present life and in our past lives, all of our thoughts, emotions, all the things that we experience are recorded in what are similar to audio-video files that are buried in our consciousness. And then when in the course, these are the karmic seeds, and when we live our lives and we are subjected to different kinds of stimulus, those files might be activated. And the things that we thought, spoke, or did at that time will come out. We'll experience these things within ourselves, within our own minds. It's an endless stream of mental associations, feelings, thoughts, images, and so forth. And based on these, this endless stream of mental associations, it will begin to affect our behavior. Now, this endless stream of associations are called afflictions, and they're considered very negative because they cause us to behave in unwise ways. So what the 108 bows does for us is it eliminates those karmic seeds before they are activated and released as a mental stream of afflictions. So this is the purpose of the 108 bows. And the reason why there are 108 bows is it's a very simple mathematical formula. There are considered within Buddhism 6 basic senses, the 5 that we are familiar with, namely the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body perceptual apparatus, plus even consciousness is considered a sense. So there are 6 kinds of experience. And in response to each kind of each kind of experience, we will generate one of 3 responses. And that is good, bad, and neutral, and also painful, pleasant, and again neutral. So 3 kinds of mental judgments, 3 kinds of emotional reactions, which means 18 kinds of mental reactions, 18 kinds of emotional reactions, for a total of 36 different kinds of reactions. Then you multiply that by 3. 36 kinds of reactions in the past, in the present, and in the future, and this gives us 108 bows. So 108 is a kind of abbreviation meaning all the different kinds of afflictions that our minds experience. Now, the way to do this at home is as follows. Do not, first of all, set up any kind of Buddha image or Bodhisattva image to bow in front of in your own home. This is very strongly discouraged within the Buddhist tradition. And what my teacher, Sun Master Songdam, strongly urges us to do is instead point yourself in the general direction of our home temple, Hwansan. Now, this is, of course, if you're a follower of Sun Master Songdam. If you are a follower of his teachings and want to practice the 108 bows, point yourself, if you're in Hong Kong, toward Korea and do the 108 bows for yourself at home. So this is the meaning of the 108 bows and also the proper way to conduct it. Okay, so I hope this answer is helpful for you, and I encourage you to continue your practice of the 108 bows because it is a very helpful support system for your meditation. And once again, I thank you for your question and for your interest in our program. This brings us to the end of today's episode. Once again, I thank all the members of our studio audience, and I thank all of our viewers at home who participated in today's program. Thank you, all of you. And once again, I will conclude with the traditional Buddhist greeting. May we all attain the Buddha. And now let's enter into our closing session of meditation. Once again, assume proper meditation posture. And with 3 strikes of the bamboo clapper, we enter into our closing meditation. 성공하십시오.